The wind cut like a knife through the dry brush of the barren town, whistling past the tired faces of those who stood in silence, their bodies sunken in the weight of a ritual they knew too well. The hissing dust choked the voices of the crowd, each one too afraid to speak, too afraid to even blink. They just watched. They always watched. In the center of the town square, beneath a sky that seemed to stretch endlessly over the land, stood a figure. Her clothes were torn at the edges, a heavy reminder of her fall from grace. But it wasn't the dirt on her face or the scrape on her bare arm that captured the attention of the crowd. No, it was the rope. The rope that had been tied tight around her wrists, cutting into her skin. The rope that bound her to the post, just as surely as the shame bound her heart. It had all come to this, a public display, a spectacle of justice that had no room for mercy. Her name was Isabella, a woman accused of witchcraft. Or maybe it was betrayal. Maybe it was both. But none of that mattered in a town where fear and rumor swirled together like the dust devils that whipped up the land. They needed a scapegoat, and she was the one who had fallen into their grasp. A hush hung in the air, punctuated only by the occasional scraping of boots on dry earth. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stood there, hands trembling, her eyes searching the crowd. The faces were a blur, but there was one face that stood out among them. A man whose eyes never left her. A man who, even in the face of public scorn, looked like he was waiting for something. Something he was afraid to act upon. A small crack of defiance pierced the silence, like a needle through cloth. A child's voice, weak but determined, called out from the back of the crowd, "Don't hurt her!" The voice was quickly swallowed by the silence that followed. But for a moment, just a moment, the crowd shifted. A ripple of discomfort ran through them, like they knew deep down what they were doing was wrong. But they did nothing. They never did. Isabella's lips trembled, and she turned her head to the side, where the figure of a man stood in the shadows, his hat low over his eyes, his jaw tight. His name was Cole Hawkins. A man of few words and even fewer friends. A broken man, some said, though no one knew what truly broke him. He was a widower, a soldier who had once fought in the wars, a cowboy whose hands had seen the rough edges of life. Isabella's heart raced. She could feel his presence like a weight pressing against her chest, heavy and unyielding. She wanted to speak, wanted to beg him to do something, but the words were stuck. The crowd was waiting for her to break, to beg for mercy. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. As the sheriff stepped forward, the crowd held their breath. His face was like stone, unfeeling, as he approached her, a brand in his hands. The metal gleamed in the sun, a cruel reminder of the punishment she would endure. "No," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't do this." But Cole moved then. His hand shot out like a storm, grabbing her arm with an intensity that shocked her. He pulled her close, his grip firm, but there was no tenderness in his touch. Not yet. "I know you can't," he whispered back, his voice low and harsh, just for her. "But I'll make sure you survive." The sheriff turned toward them, his face a mask of resolve. The crowd's murmur grew louder, a storm of voices that no one dared to challenge. Isabella's gaze flicked to Cole's eyes, searching, pleading. And for a moment, in the midst of the tension, their gazes locked. Then, with a sudden movement, Cole pulled Isabella away from the post. She stumbled, the rope biting into her wrists. as she was forced to follow him into the shadows, away from the crowd, away from the punishment that awaited her. The sheriff stood there, frozen for a heartbeat, before he barked out an order to the men around him. But it was too late. The storm had come. Will Cole's intervention be enough to change their fates? Stay tuned as their fight for survival begins. The ground beneath their boots was cracked and dry, the earth a harsh reminder of the unforgiving landscape they now traversed. The wind howled around them, kicking up the dust of the town like ghosts that had long since forgotten the names of those they once haunted. The noise of the crowd had faded into the distance, and with it, the threat of immediate violence. But the tension between Isabella and Cole remained, a silent force that hung in the air. Isabella's hands were still bound by the rope, the rough fibers digging into her skin with every step she took. Her breathing was shallow, erratic. She wanted to say something, to demand answers, but the fear was choking her, making her tongue heavy and her words useless. "I didn't ask for this," she finally whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. Her eyes were focused on the ground, not daring to look up at Cole. "I didn't ask for any of it." Cole didn't answer at first. His pace didn't falter, but there was something in the way his jaw clenched that told her he was listening. It wasn't pity. He had no room for pity, but a kind of reluctant understanding. He knew what it meant to carry a burden, to bear the weight of a past that didn't belong to you. He had enough ghosts of his own. "You didn't choose it." "No," he said, his voice low, rough from years of disuse. "But you're still in it, aren't you?" Isabella nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. It was true. She hadn't chosen this path, but here she was, dragged into it nonetheless. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the rhythmic sound of their boots on the dry earth. Cole was moving with purpose, guiding her through the narrow path that led away from the town. There was no clear destination, just a vague sense of escape, as if they were running from something bigger than the town's judgment. As they walked, Isabella felt the rope burn deeper into her wrists, the skin raw and sensitive. She could feel the sting, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest, the shame, the fear. It was all tangled up inside her, a mess of emotions she couldn't untangle. She had been branded, not by fire, but by something far worse, by suspicion, by whispers, by lies that had festered in the hearts of the townsfolk. Cole glanced at her once, his eyes scanning her face for a moment before turning back to the road ahead. There was something unreadable in his gaze, something distant. She couldn't decide if it was concern or just the hard edge of a man who had seen too much to care anymore. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice steady but firm. "They'll come after us. They won't stop." "I know," Isabella replied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "But what can we do? We're just running." He didn't answer at first, but the way his hand tightened around the reins of the horse spoke volumes. There was no running from the past, not for either of them. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren land. The wind carried a chill now, a reminder that night was coming. Cole stopped suddenly, pulling the reins of the horse to a halt. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She had expected to keep moving, to disappear into the dark, but here they were, caught in the twilight. "You're not the only one with a past," Cole said, his voice softer now, like he was sharing a secret. He turned to face her, his eyes darker in the fading light. I know what it's like to be hunted, to be marked for something you didn't do. Isabella looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard rumors, whispers of his life, of his time in the war, of the woman he had lost, but hearing it from his lips, hearing the pain in his voice, made it real. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cole didn't answer right away. Instead, he untied the rope from her wrists with a practiced hand, his fingers gentle but firm. The rope fell to the ground with a dull thud, a small but significant act of kindness in a world that had offered none. "Because," he said quietly, "no one should carry the weight of another's sins." Isabella looked up at him then, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something soft, something human. And it was then, in that fleeting moment of connection, that she realized she wasn't alone. Will Cole's unspoken promise be enough to keep them safe? Stay with us as their journey into the unknown unfolds. The first night out in the open was colder than Isabella had expected. The air bit at her skin like thousands of tiny needles, and the wind howled through the wide, empty plains, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. They had made camp in the shelter of a rocky outcrop, far enough from town to be hidden, but close enough to hear the faint echoes of distant hooves, the sound of pursuit just beyond the horizon. Isabella sat by the fire, her hands cradling a tin cup of lukewarm water, trying to warm her frozen fingers. The fire crackled, its light dancing across her tired face, casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The warmth of the fire was a fleeting comfort, but it was better than nothing. Better than the cold that gnawed at her bones. Cole was nearby, his back against a boulder, his eyes scanning the night. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel the weight of his presence, like a steady, unwavering force. There was something about him that made her feel both safer and more exposed at the same time. He had saved her from the crowd, yes, but she couldn't help but wonder what he saw in her. She was no one, a woman with a reputation made of whispers, accusations, and lies. "You should sleep," Cole finally spoke, his voice low, barely more than a breath, in the cool night air. "I'm not tired," she replied, though her voice betrayed her. She was exhausted, every inch of her body crying out for rest. But the thoughts wouldn't let her sleep. The fear, the guilt, the endless cycle of wondering what would happen next. Cole didn't argue. He didn't need to. Instead, he stoked the fire with a few dry branches, and the flames leaped higher, crackling loudly. He glanced over at her for a moment, his face hard to read, like a man made of stone. "I don't know how long we can keep running," he said after a long silence. "They'll send out a search party soon. They'll find us eventually." "I don't care," Isabella said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her voice was sharp, defensive, like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "I'd rather keep running than face them." Cole didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked toward the horizon, where the stars hung like scattered diamonds in the deep black sky. For a moment he seemed far away, lost in his own thoughts, but then he turned to her. His expression softened, just slightly, and for the briefest moment she saw the weight of his past in his eyes. "You're not the only one who's been running," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to have no place left to turn, To have everyone around you believe you're something you're not. Isabella's heart tightened at his words, and she felt an unexpected pang of empathy. She wanted to ask him more about his past, about the woman he had lost, the life that had been stolen from him. But she didn't. She didn't have the words. Instead, she simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the air. Isabella watched them float up, a brief flicker of light in the endless night. She thought about the town she had left behind, about the people who had once been her neighbors, her friends. How quickly they had turned on her. How quickly they had believed the worst of her. "It's not fair," she whispered, as if the words were meant only for the fire. "No, it's not," Cole replied, his voice just as quiet. "But life rarely is." They sat in silence for a while after that, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant cry of a coyote. The night stretched on, slow and endless, and Isabella could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. She had no illusions about their chances. The odds were slim, and their future uncertain. But somehow, being here, with Cole, in this moment, made the fear feel a little less suffocating. The fire burned lower, and the chill of the night seemed to press in closer, but neither of them moved. Cole was still watching the horizon, his eyes narrowing in the dark, his thoughts somewhere far away. Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched tightly around the hilt of his knife. He was ready for whatever came next, even if it meant facing it alone. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, to find some kind of peace in the chaos of her thoughts. She could feel the pull of sleep now, the exhaustion creeping into her bones. But she fought it. She needed to stay awake. She needed to be ready. "Cole," she said after a long pause, "what happens if they catch us?" He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers in the firelight. There was something in his gaze, something raw and real. He didn't look away as he answered, "Then we fight together." Isabella and Cole's journey is just beginning. Can they survive the trials ahead? Keep reading to discover what lies beyond the horizon. The morning light broke over the horizon like the first crack of a whip, pale and unforgiving. Isabella woke to the sound of Cole stirring beside her, the rustle of his coat as he moved to gather what little supplies they had. The fire was down to a few glowing embers, its warmth now just a memory. Her body ached from the rough sleep on the cold ground, but the deep, gnawing hunger inside her was far worse. Cole was already preparing to leave, moving with a calm precision that betrayed none of the anxiety she felt. She watched him for a moment, his figure silhouetted against the pale blue sky, and for a fleeting instant she wondered if this was all just a dream, if she would wake up in the town square, the rope still tied to her wrists, the judgment of the crowd still heavy in her chest. But she knew better. This wasn't a dream. This was survival. "You didn't sleep," she said, her voice hoarse from the night air. "I've had enough sleepless nights to last a lifetime," Cole replied, his tone blunt, but there was something softer in it now, something that wasn't quite as hard as before. "You should eat. We don't have much, but we'll need to keep our strength up." Isabella nodded, though her stomach twisted at the thought of food. She hadn't felt truly hungry in days, not since the weight of the rope had taken hold of her, the sense of betrayal, the shame. All of it gnawed at her more than any hunger ever could. Cole handed her a small piece of jerky, and she took it without a word. Her eyes met his for a moment, and she saw something in them. Something flickering, like he was trying to figure her out, trying to piece together her past as much as his own. But she didn't want to talk about that. Not yet. Instead, she chewed the jerky slowly, each bite heavy in her mouth. The salt was a bitter reminder of the miles they had already traveled, the danger that still lingered in every shadow. She didn't know where they were going, or what their next move would be. But she knew one thing. If they were going to survive, they needed to keep moving. A rustling noise in the distance caught her attention. She froze, her hand still holding the half-eaten jerky, her heart leaping into her throat. Cole's hand instinctively went to the rifle by his side, his eyes narrowing as he listened. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, and the growing tension in the air. "I think they're coming," Cole said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Isabella's blood ran cold, and she stood up immediately, every muscle in her body alert. "How many?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But then he stood, and she could see the movement now, the figures of men on horseback, riding fast, kicking up dust as they came closer. "Too many," he muttered under his breath. "We need to move. Now." Her heart was racing, her breath shallow, but there was no time for panic. Cole grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the cover of the rocks, his hand firm but not unkind. As they scrambled over the uneven ground, Isabella felt the weight of her past pressing down on her once more. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. They found shelter behind a boulder, the rock cold and unforgiving against her back. Isabella could hear the pounding of the horses' hooves, the sounds of the men drawing closer. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and she glanced over at Cole, who was already crouched, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the landscape. "Stay down," he hissed, his voice low. "Don't make a sound." She nodded, biting her lip to keep from speaking. She could feel the tears gathering in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't let herself cry. Not now, not when they were so close. The riders came into view, their figures growing larger with each passing second. Isabella held her breath, praying they wouldn't see her. She could hear the leader barking orders, his voice harsh and demanding, but it was the way they circled that made her stomach drop. They were looking for something, someone. She was their target. Isabella's heart clenched, and she had to fight the urge to run, to do something, anything, to escape. But Cole's hand on her arm was steady, unyielding. He wasn't going to let her go. The men slowed as they neared the rock outcrop, their horses shifting nervously beneath them. Isabella pressed herself deeper into the shadows, praying to stay hidden. She could feel the heat of their gaze as they passed, but they didn't stop. Not yet. And then, in that moment, something broke inside her. The fear, the hopelessness, the years of silence, all of it shattered like glass. She wasn't just a woman running anymore. She wasn't just the accused. She was alive. She was real. A crack of defiance, a voice, soft yet sharp, spoke from the depths of her soul. "No more," she whispered. Cole looked at her then, his gaze steady. He knew what she meant. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting for something more, fighting for herself, and for the first time, she felt the power of that defiance in her bones. Isabella's defiance has ignited something within her. Will it be enough to change their fates? Find out what happens next as they face the storm head-on. The silence that followed the crack of Isabella's defiance was thick, heavy with the weight of what had just been unleashed. The riders had moved past them, but Isabella didn't breathe easy. Not yet. Her heart was still hammering in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts she couldn't quite catch. She wasn't sure when it had happened, when the fear had started to bleed into something else, something fiercer. But it was there now. A thread of resolve had been sewn deep into her bones. Cole stayed still beside her, his hand still gripping his rifle, though his attention had shifted. He was watching her, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. His face, so hard and unyielding, softened ever so slightly, and Isabella saw something there, a flicker of respect. Maybe even understanding. He'd seen it too, hadn't he? The small crack of courage? The first spark of change. But then the moment passed. The riders were almost out of sight, and Cole's attention snapped back to the present. He was already calculating their next move. She could see it in the tense set of his jaw, in the way his fingers tightened around the rifle. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it that sent a shiver down Isabella's spine. "They'll circle back. We need to keep moving." Isabella nodded, her throat tight, her thoughts swirling. The fear was still there, but it was different now. She was no longer the passive victim she had once been. That woman, the one who stood in the town square with the rope around her wrists, was slipping away, piece by piece. She didn't know where this new strength had come from, but she wasn't going to question it. Not now. Cole stood, offering her a hand. It wasn't a grand gesture, but there was something in the way he held it. Steady, firm, but not demanding. She took it without hesitation, and he pulled her to her feet. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and for the first time since they had started this journey, there was a small flicker of something that felt like trust. "We head east," Cole said, his voice low. "There's an old trading post there. It's abandoned, but we can find shelter for a few days." Isabella didn't ask why he knew about the place, or why it had been abandoned. The past didn't matter now. Survival did. She followed him without question as they moved quickly through the brush, staying low, staying silent. The landscape was a blur of dusty earth and scrubby brush, the sun climbing higher in the sky with each passing minute. The wind was a constant companion, shifting the ground beneath them, carrying the scent of the wild with it. Isabella felt it against her skin, a reminder of how far they had come, and how much farther they had yet to go. Hours passed in silence, save for the crunch of dry earth beneath their boots and the occasional rustling of wind through the sparse trees. The sun beat down relentlessly, but the sweat on Isabella's brow wasn't from the heat. It was from the fear, the uncertainty. She kept her eyes on Cole's back, trusting him to lead the way. He never faltered, never looked back, his face set in that same hard expression. Finally, as the afternoon began to wane, they reached the trading post. It was nothing more than a collection of weathered wood and stone, abandoned long ago by traders and travelers who had found better paths to follow. But to Isabella, it was a sanctuary, a place to rest, to catch her breath, a moment of peace in the chaos. Cole didn't stop at the door. He scanned the area quickly, his sharp eyes taking in the empty windows, the cracked roof. He motioned for Isabella to stay close, then moved inside, his footsteps cautious but steady. The interior was dim, the light filtering in through gaps in the walls, casting long shadows on the floor. It smelled of dust and old leather, the scent of a place that had long since been forgotten. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently, just the remnants of a once-used space, an overturned barrel, some broken crates. Cole moved through the building quickly, checking every corner before finally stopping near the back wall. He gestured for Isabella to follow him, and she did, stepping carefully over the debris. "There's a stash of supplies here," Cole said, his voice low. "It'll be enough to keep us going for a few days. We'll rest here tonight, then move at first light." Isabella nodded, grateful for the brief respite, but her mind was already racing. She couldn't just rest. Not when she knew the men would be coming for her. They would hunt her down like a wounded animal, relentless and unforgiving. "I won't hide here, Cole," she said, her voice firm. "I won't stay in the shadows while they come for me. I can't." He turned to look at her then, his gaze steady, weighing her words. The silence between them stretched, thick and pregnant with unspoken truths. He knew what she meant. She wasn't just talking about the men outside. She was talking about her own fight, her own future. "You don't have to," Cole said, his voice soft but sure. "But we're not ready to face them head on. Not yet." Isabella stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The fight was there, burning in her veins, but she couldn't move too soon. Cole was right. They had to be smart. They had to wait for the right moment. And then, in the quiet of the old trading post, as the wind howled outside, Isabella made a vow to herself. She would fight. She would survive. And when the time came, she would show them all what it meant to stand tall in the face of injustice. Will Isabella find the strength to take the fight to her enemies? The next chapter of her journey is about to unfold. If you're enjoying the journey, don't miss out on future chapters. Subscribe now for more thrilling Wild West tales.